Politicians will often assert that imposing tariffs forces foreign enterprises to pay for domestic infrastructure and policy goals. This data shows the resulting spike in U.S. tariff revenue beginning in 2025. Monthly collections quickly surged toward the $30 billion mark. But there is a critical caveat. This money is actually remitted to the government by importers of record. In the vast majority of cases, those are domestic American companies. In economics, identifying the specific entity that legally writes the check to the government is known as statutory incidence. For the purposes of policy analysis, statutory incidence is virtually meaningless. A law can dictate who hands over the money, but it cannot dictate who actually loses wealth. What matters is economic incidence, the actual net change in disposable resources for buyers and sellers after a tax is applied to a transaction. Markets immediately react to new taxes by adjusting prices. This movement effectively shifts the financial burden away from the person the law intended to target. Ultimately, statutory mandates are an illusion. The true financial burden of a tax is determined by market mechanics, shifting the cost through price changes, regardless of what is written in the law. To see how these mechanics function, we use a partial equilibrium model to look at an isolated market. We start with a baseline where marginal social benefit, our demand, and marginal social cost, our supply, intersect at $1. If the government levies a 25-cent tax on the producer, costs rise. This shifts the supply curve vertically upward by the exact tax amount. This chart shows the result. With a 25-cent tax, the consumer price rises to $1.15, while the producer keeps 90 cents. The consumer's payment increases by 15 cents, the top rectangle. The producer's revenue drops by 10 cents, the bottom rectangle. A symmetry rule applies. If the law levied the tax on the consumer, their willingness to pay would drop, resulting in the exact same economic outcome. The reason the burden split is uneven, 15 cents for the buyer and 10 cents for the seller, is defined by the law of relative elasticity. This graph models a market with highly inelastic demand. Buyers barely change their behavior when prices rise. Note the steep D-prime curve. Under these conditions, the consumer burden expands massively. Because buyers are less responsive, they swallow almost the entire cost. We can translate this visual intuition into a precise mathematical proof. Consider a market where demand is 500,000 minus 20,000 P, and supply is 30,000 P. At equilibrium, demand equals supply. Solving for P gives us an original market price of $10, with 300,000 units sold. Now we introduce a specific tax of $1 per unit, levied strictly on the sellers. To find the new equilibrium, we update the supply equation. The price the producer actually receives is now the market price, P, minus the $1 tax. By equating our original demand with this taxed supply, we can solve for the new market price. The calculation shows the price for consumers rises to $10.60, while the quantity traded drops to 288,000. The result is a clean split. The consumer pays 60 cents more per unit, and the producer receives 40 cents less. This 60-40 split maps directly to the ratio of the coefficients in our original equations. Incidence is simply a mathematical function of relative elasticities. Rigorous math proves that the economic burden shifts predictably. The statutory target is irrelevant to the final distribution of the cost. In 1998, the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement imposed massive penalties on tobacco companies, intended to force them to pay for the health costs associated with their products. The policy failed to hit its intended target because cigarette demand is uniquely inelastic due to addiction. Because smokers could not easily reduce their consumption, the companies simply raised prices. The statutory punishment on the industry was mathematically passed directly to the consumers. These same mechanisms apply to subsidies, which essentially function as negative taxes. Food stamps, or SNAP benefits, are demand-side subsidies designed to help low-income families afford groceries. Issuing these benefits shifts the consumer demand curve up by the subsidy's value. However, if grocery supply is inelastic, this shift simply drives up food prices. Store owners end up capturing the benefit intended for the poor. Policymakers cannot dictate who captures a subsidy any more than they can dictate who pays a tax. The market automatically reallocates the benefit based on the participants' responsiveness. These models have focused on partial equilibrium, analyzing one market in a vacuum. In the real world, we must consider general equilibrium, the fact that a tax in one sector ripples through substitute goods, labor markets, and capital. Take a local government that places a sales tax exclusively on restaurant meals. The tax lowers restaurant output, which immediately decreases the demand for inputs like commercial real estate and specialized labor, such as cooks and waitstaff. General equilibrium teaches us that corporations do not pay taxes, people do. Every tax is eventually borne by individuals, as consumers, workers, or landowners. Over the long run, the burden concentrates on the most immobile factors, specialized workers who cannot change careers easily, or land that cannot be moved. Returning to tariffs, if foreign firms can easily move their goods to other countries, but domestic consumers have no other options, the burden on those consumers is inescapable. Ultimately, we see that statutory taxes are an illusion. The true cost of any policy flows like water, inevitably pooling on the economic agent least able to move out of its way.